Thursday, September 21st, 2:15 p.m. Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of Building 47, casting long shadows across the polished floors that someone had just finished mopping. The smell of industrial cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of coffee from the break room down the hall. This was the administrative building, home to dozens of offices where the paperwork side of military life happened. Personnel files, deployment orders, training schedules, the endless documentation that kept the machine running smoothly. Most people who walked these halls never paid attention to the man who kept them clean. He was just part of the background, like the fluorescent lights overhead or the motivational posters on the walls. He arrived before most people started their day and left after they'd gone home. His uniform was simple, navy blue coveralls with a name patch that read, Robert, in block letters. No last name, no rank, no unit designation. Just Robert, the janitor. Robert Mitchell was 71 years old, though he moved with the steady determination of someone much younger. His frame was lean, the kind of wiry build that comes from a lifetime of physical work rather than gym memberships. His face was deeply lined, weathered by years of sun and wind and experiences that left their mark on a person's features. His hair, what was left of it, was white as fresh snow, cut short in a style that suggested military habit rather than fashion choice. Every day followed the same routine. Robert would arrive at 5:30 in the morning, before the first coffee pot started brewing, before the first computers powered up. He'd start on the third floor and work his way down, methodical and thorough. Trash cans emptied, floors mopped, windows cleaned, bathrooms sanitized. By the time the offices filled with personnel, Robert had already put in 4 hours of work, making everything clean and ready for another day of military business. He ate lunch alone in a small maintenance closet on the second floor that he'd converted into a makeshift break room. A folding chair, a small table he'd salvaged from the surplus pile, an ancient microwave that still worked if you knew how to jiggle the door just right. He'd sit there with his sandwich, always the same turkey and cheese on wheat bread, and a thermos of coffee that he'd brewed at home. No radio, no phone calls, just silence and his thoughts. People passed him in the hallways dozens of times each day. Officers and enlisted personnel, civilians and contractors, everyone moving with purpose and urgency through their important military business. They might nod if they made eye contact, might say thank you if he held a door. But mostly they looked through him, the way people look through anyone in a service job. He was functional, not personal. A role, not a person. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was new to Joint Base Lewis McChord, fresh from officer candidate school with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from finally achieving a long-held dream. At 24, she was young for an officer, having gone straight from college to OCS. Her commission was barely 6 weeks old, and everything about military life still felt new and significant. She took her responsibilities seriously, maybe too seriously according to some of the senior NCOs who had already started calling her Lieutenant by the book behind her back. Sarah had been assigned to the personnel office, managing records and coordinating assignments. It wasn't the most glamorous posting, but she approached it with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Every file needed to be perfect, every form filled out correctly, every regulation followed to the letter. She stayed late most nights, reviewing work that other officers would have signed off on without a second glance. It was on one of these late evenings that Sarah first really noticed Robert. Most of the building had cleared out by 7 p.m., the offices dark and quiet. Sarah was still at her desk, working through a stack of personnel files that needed review before the next day. She heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, steady and measured, followed by the soft swish of a mop across linoleum. She got up to stretch her legs and found Robert working his way down the hallway, the same methodical precision he brought to everything. He didn't look up when she stepped out of her office, just continued his work with the focus of someone who took pride in doing things right. "Evening," Sarah said, more out of politeness than any real need for conversation. Robert paused, looked up with those pale gray eyes that seemed to carry weight behind them. "Evening, ma'am," he replied, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone who didn't use it much. Then he returned to his mopping, clearly not expecting or wanting further conversation. Sarah went back to her office, but something about the interaction stuck with her. The way he'd called her ma'am, the slight pause before he spoke, the posture that was just a fraction too straight for a civilian janitor. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at recognition without quite revealing itself. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself paying more attention to Robert. She'd see him in the hallways during her late evening work sessions, always busy, always thorough, always alone. She started saying good evening whenever she saw him, and he'd always reply with the same "evening, ma'am," before returning to his work. No small talk, no complaints about his day, no attempts to extend the conversation. Just acknowledgement and return to duty. It was the way he moved that finally clicked for Sarah. The economy of motion, the efficiency of every action, the unconscious discipline in his posture even while pushing a mop. These weren't the movements of someone who'd learned janitorial work through a training course. These were military movements, so deeply ingrained that they'd become automatic. Sarah's father had served 25 years in the army before retiring as a command sergeant major. She'd grown up on military bases, surrounded by service members her entire life. She knew the way military training changed people, the way it showed up in everything they did even years after they'd taken off the uniform for the last time. Robert Mitchell moved like a soldier. More than that, he moved like a soldier who'd served long enough for it to become part of his DNA. The realization made Sarah start looking at him differently. Not prying, not intrusive, just observant. She noticed the way he stood when talking to people, the automatic respect he showed regardless of rank, the precise organization of his cleaning cart. Small details that most people would never notice, but that told a story if you knew how to read them. Then came the day that changed everything. Friday, October 13th, a day that started like any other but ended up revealing a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Sarah was working late again, trying to get ahead on the following week's assignments. The building was nearly empty, just her and a couple of other workaholics burning the midnight oil. She heard Robert's cart rolling down the hallway, the familiar sound of his evening cleaning routine. She'd been meaning to use the bathroom for an hour but had been too focused on her work. Finally, nature demanded attention. She stepped out of her office and headed down the hall, passing Robert who was working on one of the other offices. They exchanged their usual evening greeting, and Sarah continued to the women's bathroom at the end of the corridor. The building's bathroom facilities were being renovated, one at a time. The women's bathroom on the second floor had been closed for repairs for the past 2 weeks, forcing female personnel to use facilities on other floors. Sarah had forgotten about this, her mind still half focused on the personnel files she'd been reviewing. She pushed open the bathroom door and immediately realized her mistake. Wrong bathroom. She was about to back out when she heard a sound that stopped her cold. Someone was in one of the stalls, and they were crying. Not loud, dramatic sobbing, but the quiet, restrained crying of someone who'd learned to grieve in silence. Sarah froze, uncertain what to do. Military culture didn't encourage emotional displays, especially not for men. Whoever was in that stall was clearly trying to keep their breakdown private. She should leave, give them their privacy, pretend she'd never heard anything. But something in those quiet sobs spoke to a pain so deep that Sarah couldn't just walk away. She approached slowly, carefully, making her footsteps audible so she wouldn't startle whoever was there. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The crying stopped immediately. Sarah heard movement in the stall, the sound of someone pulling themselves together, taking deep breaths, trying to compose themselves. Then the lock clicked and the door opened. Robert Mitchell stood there, his weathered face wet with tears he'd been trying to hide. His gray eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a pain that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. He looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something else, something that looked like relief at finally being seen. "I'm fine, ma'am," he said, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. Just a bad day. I'll get back to work. But Sarah had seen something when the stall door opened. In his hand, Robert was holding a photograph, gripped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The edges were worn, the image faded, clearly a picture he'd looked at countless times over the years. "Robert," Sarah said gently. "You don't look fine. Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head, starting to move past her toward the door. But Sarah, acting on instinct rather than protocol, reached out and gently touched his arm. Not restraining, just connecting. A gesture that said, "I see you, I care, you don't have to be alone with this." Robert stopped. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, his back to Sarah, his shoulders rigid with decades of practiced self-control. Then, slowly, those shoulders began to shake. The photograph slipped from his fingers, falling to the tiled floor. Sarah bent down to pick it up, and what she saw in that faded image made her breath catch. 5 young men in military uniforms, standing in front of a helicopter. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, radiating the kind of confidence and camaraderie that only exists between people who trust each other with their lives. The date stamped in the corner read April 1971. "Vietnam?" Sarah asked quietly. Robert nodded without turning around. "My crew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today's the anniversary. The day we went down." Sarah waited, understanding that some stories can't be rushed. Some truths have been held inside for so long that they need space and silence to finally emerge. October 13, 1971, Robert continued, still not looking at her. "We were flying support for a ground operation near the Laotian border. Took heavy fire. Lost the tail rotor. We went down hard in triple canopy jungle." He finally turned to face Sarah, and in his eyes she saw the weight of 5 decades of survivor's guilt, 5 decades of carrying memories that most people couldn't comprehend. "I was the crew chief. 21 years old. It was my job to get everyone out." His voice cracked. "I got 2 of them out. Got them maybe 50 yards from the crash before it exploded. But the other 3. He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah stood perfectly still, the photograph held carefully in her hands like the sacred object it was. This was more than just a picture. This was a shrine to brothers lost, to a moment when everything changed, to a burden this man had carried alone for 53 years. "The pilots died in the crash," Robert continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "But my gunner, Davis, he was trapped in the wreckage. Alive. Calling for help. And I couldn't get to him. The fire was too intense. I tried. God knows I tried. But I couldn't reach him. I had to listen to him." His voice broke completely. Sarah did something that violated every protocol, every professional boundary she'd been taught. She stepped forward and hugged Robert Mitchell, this 71-year-old janitor she barely knew, this veteran who'd been carrying 53 years of pain in silence. And Robert, who hadn't talked about that day to anyone in decades, who'd kept his service record and his medals locked away in a storage unit because looking at them hurt too much, who'd taken a janitorial job at a military base because being around service members was the closest he could come to the family he'd lost, finally broke down completely. They stood there in that bathroom for 10 minutes while Robert cried decades of tears he'd never allowed himself to shed. Sarah just held him, providing the human connection he'd been denying himself for most of his adult life. When he finally pulled away, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief he'd pulled from his coveralls, he looked at Sarah with something like wonder. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "That was inappropriate. I should." "Stop," Sarah interrupted gently. "Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for grieving your brothers." She handed him back the photograph, and he took it with shaking hands, looking down at those 5 young faces frozen forever in a moment of youth and hope. "Tell me about them," Sarah said. "Please. They deserve to be remembered." And so, Standing in that military base bathroom at 9:30 on a Friday night, Robert Mitchell finally spoke the names he'd been carrying in silence. Lieutenant James Mackenzie, the pilot who taught Robert how to play poker and who'd been planning to propose to his girlfriend when they got back stateside. Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Chen, the co-pilot who'd been studying for his college degree and dreamed of being a teacher. And Specialist Raymond Davis, the door gunner who'd been just 19 years old and who Robert had promised to protect. Sarah listened to every word, honoring these men she'd never met with her full attention and respect. When Robert finished, she asked a question that came from her gut rather than her training. "Robert, why does nobody here know about your service?" He shrugged, a gesture that tried for casual but fell far short. "I'm just the janitor, ma'am. Nobody asks janitors about their past. And honestly, that's been fine with me. After I came home, after the hospitals and the therapy and the nightmares, I just wanted to be invisible. Wanted to disappear into normal life." "Did it work?" Sarah asked. Robert smiled, but it was one of the saddest expressions Sarah had ever seen. "I've been invisible for 50 years, ma'am. I'd say it worked pretty well." Sarah made a decision in that moment, one that she knew might be overstepping, might be unwelcome, might change everything. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. "Robert, would you come with me? There's something I need to show you." He looked confused but followed as she led him back to her office. She gestured for him to sit in the visitor's chair, then pulled up the personnel database on her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she navigated through multiple security clearances that her position granted her access to. "What are you looking for?" Robert asked nervously. "Your service record," Sarah replied, still typing. "Every veteran who works on base has one in the system, even civilians. It's usually just basics, dates of service, discharge status. But sometimes..." She trailed off as she found what she was looking for. The screen filled with Robert Mitchell's official military service record. Sarah's eyes widened as she began to read, scrolling through page after page of information that told a story she suspected Robert had never shared with anyone at this base. "Robert," she said softly. "You're not just a Vietnam veteran. You're a decorated war hero." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's ancient history, ma'am." But Sarah was still reading, her expression growing more amazed with each line. 2 silver stars. 4 bronze stars with V device for valor. A distinguished flying cross. 2 purple hearts. An air medal with 45 oak leaf clusters. She looked up at him. "Do you know what this means? Do you know how rare this level of recognition is?" "I know what I did," Robert said quietly. "And I know what I failed to do. The medals don't change that." Sarah came around the desk and knelt beside his chair so she could look him in the eyes. "Robert, you completed 127 combat missions. You're credited with saving the lives of 43 wounded soldiers during medevac operations under fire. Your crew was nominated for the Presidential Unit Citation." She paused, reading further. "After your crash, you carried both surviving crew members to safety while injured yourself. You held off enemy forces for 6 hours until rescue arrived, despite having a fractured vertebra and a bullet wound in your shoulder." Robert's eyes filled with tears again. "But I couldn't save the other 3. That's what matters. That's what I'll always remember." "That's not all you should remember," Sarah said firmly. "You served 4 more years after that crash. You volunteered for the most dangerous missions. You saved dozens of lives. You were a hero, Robert. You are a hero." He shook his head. "I'm a janitor who couldn't save his friends." Sarah stood up, her mind racing. She'd been trained to follow protocols, to respect chain of command, to do everything by the book. But sometimes the book didn't have the right answers. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts and do what was right, even if it meant bending a few rules. "Will you trust me?" she asked. "Will you let me do something that I think is important?" Robert looked uncertain but nodded slowly. I guess so, ma'am. Though I'm not sure what you're planning. Sarah spent the rest of that evening and most of Saturday making phone calls and sending emails. She reached out to the base commander's office, to the Public Affairs Division, to veteran service organizations. She explained the situation, shared Robert's service record, and made a case for something that hadn't been done at this base in over a decade. By Monday morning, word had spread through the building. Not gossip or rumor, but official communication through the chain of command. The base commander himself had gotten involved, intrigued by Sarah's request and moved by Robert Mitchell's story. Robert arrived for work Monday at his usual 5:30 a.m., unaware that anything had changed. He followed his normal routine, starting on the third floor, working his way down through the building with his usual methodical precision. But when he reached the second floor at approximately 7:45 a.m., he found something that stopped him in his tracks. The hallway was lined with personnel, dozens of soldiers and officers standing at attention. At the far end of the corridor, near the main entrance, stood Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, in his dress uniform. Robert stood frozen, his cleaning cart abandoned, confusion and something like fear crossing his weathered face. He looked around for an escape route, ready to bolt rather than face whatever this was. That's when Sarah appeared from one of the offices, also in her dress uniform. She approached him with a smile that was both gentle and proud. "Robert," she said. "These people are here for you." "I don't understand," he stammered. "I need to get to work. I have floors to clean." "The floors can wait," Colonel Morrison said, walking forward to stand before Robert. "We have something more important to do this morning." The colonel held out his hand, and an aide placed a wooden display case in his palm. Inside, arranged on blue velvet, were medals that Robert hadn't seen in decades. His medals, the ones he'd locked away in a storage unit because looking at them brought too much pain. "Robert Mitchell," Colonel Morrison said in a voice that carried through the corridor. "For 53 years, you've carried the burden of your service in silence. You've hidden your sacrifice, your valor, your brotherhood. You've worked among us as just another civilian employee, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, content to be invisible." Robert's eyes were locked on those medals, tears streaming down his face without shame or embarrassment. "But you are not invisible," the colonel continued. "Not anymore. Not to this command. Not to these soldiers. And not to your country. Today, we honor you not just for your decorated service, but for the strength it took to come home, to build a life, to continue serving in your own quiet way." The colonel opened the display case and began removing medals, pinning each one carefully to Robert's navy blue coveralls. As he worked, he read the citation for each award, his voice filled with respect and admiration. Silver Star, for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Distinguished Flying Cross, for heroism while participating in aerial flight. Purple Heart, for wounds received in action. With each medal, more members of the hallway detail straightened their postures, some wiping tears from their own eyes. This wasn't just ceremony. This was recognition of sacrifice that had been hidden for too long. When the last medal was pinned in place, Colonel Morrison stepped back and rendered a sharp salute. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Mitchell. Welcome home." And then something remarkable happened. Every service member in that hallway, from the newest private to the most senior sergeant major, saluted in unison. It wasn't a planned movement, wasn't in the program. It was spontaneous recognition of a warrior who had earned their respect 5 decades ago but was only now receiving it. Robert Mitchell, 71-year-old janitor, stood in his work coveralls now decorated with medals he'd thought he'd never wear again. He looked at these soldiers honoring him, at Lieutenant Chen who had seen him when everyone else looked through him, at the colonel who had taken time from running an entire base to recognize one man's pain and service. Slowly, his hand trembling with emotion, Robert returned the salute. His form was perfect, muscle memory from 50 years ago returning as if he'd never stopped serving. And in that moment, he was no longer invisible. He was Sergeant Robert Mitchell, United States Army, veteran of 127 combat missions, holder of multiple Valor Awards, and brother to all who served. The formation broke, but people didn't immediately disperse. Instead, they approached Robert one by one. Young privates who wanted to shake his hand. Senior NCOs who wanted to thank him. Officers who wanted to hear just one story from his service. For the first time in decades, Robert didn't deflect or minimize or hide. He accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity. Lieutenant Chen stayed by his side through it all, introducing him to people, facilitating conversations, making sure he wasn't overwhelmed. She had started this, and she felt a responsibility to see it through. When the corridor finally cleared and it was just the two of them, Robert turned to Sarah with eyes still wet from tears. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "I was fine being invisible." Sarah shook her head. "No, you weren't fine. You were surviving, but that's not the same as living. You were serving in silence, but that's not the same as being honored. You were carrying your burden alone, but that's not the same as being supported by your brothers and sisters in arms." "I don't deserve this," Robert said, looking down at the medals on his chest. "That's exactly why you deserve it," Sarah replied. "True heroes never think they deserve recognition. They just do what needs to be done and live with the weight of it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't honor them. That doesn't mean they should carry that weight alone." Robert was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for seeing me." The next week, something changed in Building 47. Robert Mitchell still came to work at 5:30 a.m., still cleaned the floors and emptied the trash cans, still did his job with the same methodical precision. But he was no longer invisible. People stopped to talk to him in the hallways. Officers asked about his service. Enlisted personnel sought his advice. He was invited to speak at the monthly commander's call, where he told the story of his crew for the first time in front of an audience. He talked about Lieutenant Mackenzie and Chief Warrant Officer Chen and Specialist Davis, making sure their names were remembered, their sacrifice honored. He started eating lunch in the main break room instead of his maintenance closet, sitting with other veterans who worked on base. They'd swap stories, share memories, support each other through the difficult days that all veterans have. Robert discovered he wasn't alone in his pain, and that sharing it made the burden lighter. He even started wearing one of his medals on his coveralls every day. Not all of them, that would feel like showing off. But one, different each day. A reminder to himself and to others that service takes many forms, and all of them deserve respect. Sarah Chen continued her work in the personnel office, but she'd learned something important from Robert Mitchell. She learned that sometimes the most important military work happens off the battlefield. Sometimes it's about seeing the invisible, honoring the forgotten, and making sure that no veteran carries their burden alone. She started a program on base called Unseen Heroes, designed to identify and honor civilian veterans working in various capacities. Turned out Robert wasn't the only decorated veteran who'd been hiding in plain sight. There was a cafeteria worker who'd served in Desert Storm. A security guard who'd done 3 tours in Iraq. A librarian who'd been a combat medic in Afghanistan. Each one had their own story, their own service, their own quiet heroism. And each one was given the recognition they deserved, brought out of the shadows and into the light, reminded that their service mattered and their sacrifice was not forgotten. On October 13, 2024, exactly 53 years after his helicopter went down in the jungles of Vietnam, Robert Mitchell stood in a military cemetery before 3 headstones. Lieutenant James Mackenzie, Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Chen, and Specialist Raymond Davis, together in death as they'd been in life. Robert wasn't alone. Sarah was there, along with a dozen other veterans from the base who had insisted on coming. They stood in respectful silence as Robert placed the old photograph at the base of the central headstone, the image of 5 young men who believed they were invincible. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back," Robert said to the graves. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. But I want you to know I never forgot. Not for a single day in 53 years. He stood at attention and rendered a salute that held 5 decades of grief, guilt, love, and respect. And behind him, every veteran in attendance did the same, honoring not just these 3 fallen heroes, but all who had given their lives in service. As they walked back to the parking lot, Sarah asked Robert how he was feeling. "Lighter," he said after a moment's thought. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel lighter. Like maybe I can put down some of this weight I've been carrying." "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," Sarah reminded him. "That's what family is for. And we're your family now, whether you like it or not." Robert smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered face. "I think I can live with that, ma'am." "Sarah," she corrected. "When we're not on duty, just call me Sarah." "Yes, ma'am," Robert said with a slight grin. "Sarah." They both laughed, and in that moment, Robert Mitchell realized something profound. He'd spent 53 years trying to be invisible, trying to hide from his pain and his past. But what he'd really needed all along was to be seen, truly seen, by someone who understood that service and sacrifice come in many forms and that all of them deserve honor. In the months that followed, Robert's story spread beyond Joint Base Lewis McChord. Veteran organizations reached out, wanting to feature his story. A local newspaper wrote an article about the janitor who turned out to be a war hero. High schools invited him to speak to students about service and sacrifice. Robert handled it all with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to mopping floors. He never made himself the center of the story. Every interview, every speech, every conversation came back to his crew, to the brothers he'd lost, to the importance of remembering all who served. He also became a mentor to young veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. He'd meet them for coffee, listen to their stories, share his own experiences. He couldn't save his crew in 1971, but maybe he could help save some of the current generation from the isolation and invisible wounds that he'd suffered through alone. Sarah Chen was promoted to captain 2 years later, recognized not just for her administrative skills but for her leadership in veteran advocacy. At her promotion ceremony, she asked Robert to pin on her new rank. As he carefully attached the captain's bars to her uniform, she whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what it really means to serve." "Thank you for seeing me," he whispered back. Now, on any given day at Joint Base Lewis McChord, you might see an older gentleman in navy blue coveralls walking the halls of Building 47. He's usually pushing a cleaning cart, mopping floors or emptying trash cans. But if you look closely, you'll see medals pinned to his chest. And if you take the time to stop and talk to him, he'll tell you about 5 young men who flew together in Vietnam, about brotherhood and sacrifice, about loss and survival. He'll tell you that heroes don't always wear dress uniforms. Sometimes they wear work clothes and carry mops. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, doing honest work and carrying heavy memories. Sometimes they just need one person to really see them, to recognize their service, to remind them that they're not alone. Robert Mitchell is no longer invisible. And because one young lieutenant took the time to look beyond the janitor to see the hero underneath, dozens of other unseen veterans have been brought into the light, honored for their service, and reminded that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Every October 13th, Robert still visits those 3 graves. But now he's accompanied by a growing family of veterans who understand his pain and share his commitment to remembering. They stand together in that cemetery, a living testament to the bonds that service creates, bonds that transcend time and death and silence. And every day, in hallways and offices across military installations worldwide, there are heroes hiding in plain sight. Janitors and cafeteria workers, security guards and maintenance crews, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs while carrying extraordinary stories. They're waiting for someone to see them. Really see them. To look beyond the uniform they're not wearing to recognize the service they've rendered. To understand that heroism doesn't end when you take off the military uniform for the last time. It just takes a different form. Quieter perhaps, less visible, but no less real. The question is, who will you see today? Whose story are you walking past without noticing? Whose service are you overlooking because it doesn't fit your image of what a hero should look like? Robert Mitchell spent 53 years being invisible. It took one observant lieutenant to change that. But there are thousands more like him, veterans who've traded their military uniforms for civilian work clothes, who serve in silence, who carry their memories and their medals locked away from sight. They don't need parades or celebrations. They just need to be seen. Acknowledged. Reminded that their service mattered, that their sacrifice counts, that they're not alone. So take a second look at the people around you. The person cleaning your office might be a decorated combat veteran. The security guard checking IDs could be a former Special Forces operator. The quiet person eating lunch alone might be carrying stories that would humble and inspire you. Heroes walk among us every day. They wear work boots instead of combat boots. They carry mops instead of weapons. They push carts instead of leading charges. But they're heroes nonetheless, and they deserve our recognition, our respect, and our gratitude. Because at the end of the day, service is service. Sacrifice is sacrifice. And every veteran, whether they're still in uniform or have long since hung it up, deserves to know that what they did mattered. That who they are matters. That they are seen, honored, and never forgotten. Robert Mitchell knows this now. After 53 years of invisibility, he's finally been seen. And in being seen, he's found healing he didn't know was possible, connection he'd been denying himself, and a new purpose in making sure that no other veteran spends decades hiding in the shadows. That's the real lesson of his story. Not that heroes exist in unexpected places, though they do. But that we all have the power to see them, to honor them, to bring them into the light where they belong. All it takes is paying attention. Really looking at the people around us. Taking the time to see beyond the surface to the stories underneath. And having the courage to say two simple words that can change everything: thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for being brave enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. Thank you for continuing to serve in whatever capacity you can. Thank you for being an example of strength and resilience and quiet dignity. Thank you for being a hero, even when nobody knew it. Especially when nobody knew it. Because those are often the truest heroes of all. The ones who serve without recognition, sacrifice without acclaim, and continue showing up every day to do the work that needs doing, carrying burdens that would break lesser people, asking for nothing in return. They're all around us. In our workplaces and our communities, in our businesses and our neighborhoods. Veterans who've traded their uniforms for civilian clothes but never stopped serving, never stopped caring, never stopped embodying the values they learned in the military. They just need someone to see them. To really see them. To look beyond the job title or the work clothes to recognize the warrior still standing there, still serving, still strong despite everything they've endured. Will you be that person? Will you take the time to see the unseen heroes in your life? Will you honor their service and remind them that they matter? Robert Mitchell hopes you will. Because he knows from personal experience what a difference it makes. How healing it can be. How transformative it is to finally be seen after years of invisibility. And somewhere in Vietnam, in a jungle that has long since reclaimed a crash site, 3 young men who never made it home are smiling. Because their brother kept his promise. He survived. He lived a good life. And he made sure they were never forgotten, that their story was told, that their sacrifice was honored. That's what real heroes do. They take care of their brothers. They honor the fallen. They keep the promises they made, even when it takes 53 years to fulfill them. Thank you, Robert Mitchell, for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for surviving and thriving and finally allowing yourself to be seen. Thank you for teaching us all what quiet heroism looks like. And thank you, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, for having the eyes to see and the courage to act. For refusing to let a hero remain invisible. For understanding that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply recognize the people right in front of us. Heroes walk among us. Every single day. In every workplace, every community, every corner of our society. They're waiting to be seen. To be honored. To be reminded that what they did matters, that who they are matters, that they are not forgotten.